On the 7th of December 2015, Donald Trump posted a video to Facebook which violated rules against hate speech. But key people inside the company talked its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, out of deleting it. And over the coming years, one of them, Joel Kaplan, would have a decisive role in reshaping the platform to favor conservatives and shelter misinformation and hate speech. This would have a profound impact not only on the website but on America itself, culminating in the deadly attack on the US Capitol. In his video, Trump had called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. Zuckerberg and many of his employees felt that the video violated Facebook's rules on hate speech, and even he was personally disgusted by it. But Kaplan and others persuaded him to create an ad hoc exception to the rules for what they called newsworthy political discourse. And this didn't just help Trump, but other controversial leaders too, including Duterte, Bolsonaro, and Modi. Kaplan, a Republican, joined the company in 2011 partly to rebalance its political leanings, which tended towards Democrats. He became the company's chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. Before that, he had been deputy chief of staff for Republican President George Bush over 8 years, and even worked for Antonin Scalia, the controversial conservative Supreme Court judge. Straight out the gate, he worked to shift Facebook's leadership to be more conservative. He appointed fellow conservatives to key positions, and did away with the tradition that the head lobbyist and their deputy should be from different parties, balancing each other out, instead appointing a fellow Republican as his deputy. Fast forward to the end of 2016, and in the aftermath of Trump's stunning presidential victory, security engineers at Facebook made an equally stunning discovery. Codenamed Project P for propaganda, a team found that misinformation had spread on the website at lightning speeds to vast numbers of Americans during the election. And not only that, but a large part of it had apparently been driven by the GRU, Russia's infamous military intelligence agency. That's the same agency that's thought to have poisoned people in the UK and blew up an arms depot in the Czech Republic. But Kaplan opposed shutting down the malicious pages, arguing that doing so would disproportionately impact conservatives. And he had a lot of sway because in addition to being the chief lobbyist, content moderation teams directly reported to him, putting him on the front line of deciding what should and shouldn't be allowed on the platform. Not only that, but he argued against disclosing the full extent of Russian interference to the general public. And when the company held a meeting to answer questions from its staff about the investigation's findings, it was Kaplan, not the lead investigator, who answered the questions. Later in 2017, the company came up with a way to reduce misinformation, but Kaplan watered it down. The idea was to prioritize posts by friends and family over publishers in the newsfeed. But Kaplan was worried that this would impact right-wing publishers more than others, and he was right. Data analysts confirmed to him that it would, so he pushed for the algorithm to be weakened so that conservative publishers wouldn't be impacted so much. Then in 2018, Kaplan drew flack for appearing at the Senate hearing of controversial Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh, who was chosen by Trump. Kaplan said they were just longtime friends, but some perceived the move as a way to draw favor with the president. And indeed, Kaplan appeared to have a comfortable relationship with the White House, having even been considered at one point for a senior position in Trump's team. But it wasn't until 2020 and the terrifying crescendo of the Capitol attack that the full extent of Facebook's shift to the right and shelter of misinformation became apparent. In August, a few months before Election Day, Facebook's own analysts found that groups on the platform were becoming breeding grounds for misinformation and hate. Engineers proposed a simple solution: exclude political groups from the Groups You Should Join module on the website. But Kaplan's team pushed back on it, saying it would create thrash in the political ecosystem, leaving millions of users exposed to a gateway to hate and misinformation. His team eventually backed down, but only in the final weeks of the election, and it was only meant to be a temporary measure. To make matters worse, the company also became aware that its in-feed recommendation system was malfunctioning to the advantage of conservatives. It was meant to recommend content to users that they might like, but it was recommending posts from conservatives like Ben Shapiro to people who had never engaged with that kind of content before. And instead of fixing the issue, Kaplan's team advocated for it to be left as it was. They argued that if it was fixed, that would reduce traffic to the affected publications, which would generate complaints that Facebook was biased against conservatives. But in the final weeks of the election, the ever-growing tide of misinformation became so strong that the company began to fear for the integrity of the election itself. It deployed a range of emergency break-glass measures to stem the flow of misinformation. Key among these was News Ecosystem Quality, or NEQ, a score assigned to publishers based on the quality of their journalism. Remarkably, the measures seemed to have a positive impact, displaying more credible and accurate content in the newsfeed and other places. But once election day had passed, Kaplan and others opposed NEQ's continuation, and so it expired, allowing the flow of misinformation to resume, and some believe that had catastrophic consequences. By the 6th of January, with Trump having refused to concede to Biden, and the tide of misinformation continuing unabated, a crowd of his supporters attacked the US Congress, taking American democracy to the brink of failure and resulting in several deaths. After the attack, an internal company report concluded that it had failed to act strongly enough to curtail the Stop the Steal movement following the election. Despite no evidence of voter fraud, misinformation spread rapidly, claiming that Trump had won. And because Facebook had scaled back its emergency measures, there was little to stop it. One former employee said that this was simply to prioritize growth over safety. And even then, the attack didn't prove to be much of a watershed moment from what we can tell. It did cause the company to make the earlier restriction on political groups permanent. But NEQ, the measure to improve the quality of news on the platform, was only deployed temporarily after the attack. Once the dust had settled, it was once again rolled back, continuing a cycle of panic and neglect. All of this took its toll on people within the company. After the election, at least 6 employees left, citing failures on misinformation and hate speech. And 4 of them explicitly named Kaplan as having a negative impact on their work, calling for him to have less power in the company. Rebutting the criticism, a Facebook spokesperson ironically dismissed the focus on Kaplan as a conspiracy theory, but a deluge of former employees pointed the finger at him and his team. A former data scientist wrote a stinging memo charging that Kaplan's team regularly protects powerful constituencies. It detailed how the team intervened to remove penalties from right-wing pages which had been penalized for spreading misinformation, overriding judgments by independent fact-checkers. That echoed earlier claims that the team had removed penalties from notable conservative publications including Breitbart News and Praga University. Kaplan was even reported to have personally intervened to remove a penalty from a post by Charlie Kirk, a high-profile conservative. And some staff felt that the problem was partly because of the way the company was structured, leaving Kaplan with a conflict of interest. In one internal note, a senior figure responsible for combating misinformation and hate speech highlighted the issue. Essentially, because Kaplan had authority over both lobbying and content moderation, moderation was at the service of his lobbying priorities. The head of the earlier Russian interference investigation put it well. You don't want moderation people reporting to someone who's in charge of keeping people in government happy. And in another internal note, a moderation researcher confirmed that this was a big problem, contending that the platform had knowingly exposed users to misinformation out of fears over potential backlash from the public and politicians. They said that the pages of publications like Breitbart and Fox News had become havens for death threats and hate speech. And other platforms don't allow this conflict of interest. Twitter and Google maintain a firewall between their lobbying and content moderation teams. Throughout all this, Zuckerberg has remained steadfastly supportive of Kaplan, even becoming quite defensive on one occasion. In May 2020, after George Floyd was murdered by police, Zuckerberg decided not to censor a highly inflammatory statement by Trump. And at an employee meeting to discuss that decision, one of the most upvoted questions said that staff felt Kaplan had too much power over decisions like this one. That made Zuckerberg highly defensive. He effectively ignored the question and implied that people wanted Kaplan out of his job simply because he was a Republican. So, despite mounting criticism both inside and outside the company over Kaplan's apparent bias towards conservative publications and his willingness to shelter misinformation and hate speech, his position in the company looks to be rock solid, enjoying Zuckerberg's full confidence. That could of course change as more comes to light about the role of social media in the Capitol attack, but in the end he may survive this storm just as he has before. Whatever happens, Kaplan seems to have been instrumental in shifting the platform to the right and fostering a misinformation crisis, and Facebook has shown little sign of wanting to change course.